Watch out, be on your guard against all kinds of greed. Luke 12:15.
The Bible is just one example. History is full of references on greed from different cultures at different times. And it still seems to be relevant today. But what is greed actually? Where does it come from and how does it affect one's life? Psychology is the science of behavior and experience. Maybe it can provide us some answers. First, we need to talk about what greed actually is. Defining a rather abstract phenomenon is not that easy. For different people, terms have sometimes slightly different meanings. However, there are approaches to find the core elements of greed. In studies, people were asked to name central characteristics of greed. The desire to acquire more and the dissatisfaction of never having enough emerged as core elements. Envy and materialism also appeared in this context, although they were identified more as side effects. The distinction between greed and envy, for example, can be sometimes unclear, although there are two separate concepts. Envy is the feeling that someone else is in a more advantageous position than oneself, whereas greed focuses more on one's own needs. How to measure greed? In the past, psychology tended to use philosophical methods to gain knowledge. Nowadays, however, psychology sees itself as an empirical science. In other words, phenomena are studied on the basis of empirical data. Empirical data is data that is obtained by experience. Observations or measurements are, for example, empirical data. Here's an example. If we want to determine the size of the Empire State Building, we could really hard think about it. Or we could collect empirical data and use a tape measure. Unfortunately, it's more difficult with psychological phenomena. We cannot simply use a tape measure and read off someone's greed. Greed is a construct, a phenomenon that is not observable directly. We have to infer it by observing a person's behavior. To do this systematically, we have to operationalize the construct. That means to make it measurable using observable variables. Psychological phenomena are often measured by using specifically designed tests. A test that measures a person's greed as a fundamental characteristic is the so-called Dispositional Greed Scale, or DGS. It consists of 7 questions that people are asked to agree with on a scale from 1 to 5. These are statements such as, "I always want more," or "You can never have too much money." This is how we operationalize greed. The DGS has been used in many studies and has shown conclusive results. In research, the DGS has been used to examine various aspects of behavior, including financial decisions, moral attitudes, and the propensity for competitive behavior. Positive characteristics of greed. So we can measure greed. We can now make empirical, verifiable statements about it. To do this, correlation studies are often conducted. This involves comparing 2 or more characteristics with each other and checking if there is a correlation between them. Here is an example. A study from the financial behavior of 4,000 young people from the Netherlands showed that greed was associated with higher income and higher spending. However, greedy people were also less likely to save money and more likely to have debt. Or another example. A survey with a representative sample of the Dutch population showed that greed was correlated with a higher household income. It was also found that greedy people tend to have more sexual partners in their lifetime. At this point, it's important to emphasize that within correlation studies, we cannot determine the direction of the correlation. For example, we don't know if greedy people tend to earn more or if people that earn more are more likely to be greedy. Negative characteristics of greed. Okay, we have now seen that greed sometimes has positive effects, but there are also downsides. The downsides of greed can be seen, for example, in an economic context. It has a negative effect on a shareholder's profit if the CEO scores high on the dispositional greed scale. Greedy CEOs are also less likely to invest in corporate social responsibility. On this social level, other negative effects of greed can be seen. Greed prevents pro-social action. This was seen during the coronavirus pandemic. Greed was the strongest predictor of hoarding. But greed is not only associated with negative effects on one's environment. Greedy people tend to have a lower life satisfaction and well-being. It's also associated with lower self-confidence and less trust in other people. As you can see, there are many reasons why greed is overall seen as a negative character trait and why many historical sources condemn it. But where does it actually come from? The so-called life history theory offers an interesting explanation. It tries to explain the adaptations from humans to their environments from an evolutionary perspective. In the context of greed, following hypotheses can be formulated. When children grow up in a stable and predictable environment, they learn that the future can be planned. They therefore adapt a lifestyle that is based on long-term goals and pro-social behavior. However, if children grow up in uncertain, unpredictable environments, they later pursue life strategies that secure them advantageous positions, even in uncertain times. One strategy could be to accumulate as much resources as you can for as long as you can, so that you have enough even when the environment changes again. In short, being greedy. And indeed, there was evidence found for the validity of this theory. Researchers have now, in line with the theory, hypothesized that the unpredictability of the childhood is associated with a higher dispositional greed. Greed was again measured using the dispositional greed scale. And indeed, there was a connection found between the dispositional greed scale and the unpredictability of the childhood. The previous hypothesis was accepted and the life history theory was strengthened. We looked at the definition, the measurement methods and the current theory on greed. Unfortunately, it has to be said that although there's a lot talked about greed, the phenomenon is still quite poorly researched. Many of the studies cited had been conducted in previous years and have still to be replicated. But the current state of research provides a good basis to understand the phenomenon of greed even better in the future. And this is great.